For thousands of years, the world believed that wealth was measured only by gold, land, and power. But deep in the heart of ancient China, an empire was quietly writing a different formula, a formula for financial power that would outlive dynasties, shape future economies, and still influence how the modern world operates today. This is the story of hidden financial engineering, secret state strategies, and economic manipulation. Centuries before Wall Street existed, this is the untold financial history of ancient China. Our story begins over 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty, a world where kingdoms fought for land, emperors fought for loyalty, and ordinary people fought just to survive another day. But behind this chaos, the empire was running a silent operation, an experiment that would change the concept of money forever. While the rest of the world used gold and silver, China created the first fiat system, not by accident, not by innovation, but by necessity. Because the emperor discovered something: if you control the money, you control the people. If you control the people, you control the future. One of the most powerful financial engines in ancient China wasn't a bank, it was something far more unexpected: salt and iron. In 81 BC, the Han Dynasty took full control over the production and sale of both. Why? Because the ministers realized a hidden truth: people can live without gold, but they cannot live without salt. Salt preserved food, healed wounds, kept armies alive, and sustained millions. Iron built tools, weapons, infrastructure, and the foundation of the military machine. By monopolizing these two essentials, the empire created a state-run mega-corporation centuries before the word corporation even existed. This monopoly became the engine that funded wars, stabilized prices, crushed rebellions, and strengthened the emperor's grip. Every grain of salt sold, every iron tool bought, generated revenue that flowed directly into the imperial treasury. Modern economists call it resource-backed governance. In reality, it was economic domination disguised as public service. You may think economic advisors are a modern concept, but 2,300 years ago, during the Warring States period, ancient China secretly assembled what may have been the world's earliest group of elite financial strategists. They weren't warriors, they weren't nobles, they were thinkers, statisticians, philosophers, people who studied human behavior and supply chains long before we had those words. Their job not to collect taxes, but to engineer society, to predict shortages before they happened, to prevent price collapses, to manipulate markets for national advantage, and to ensure the ruling dynasty stayed in control no matter what. One strategist, Song introduced a brutal economic doctrine: a nation grows strong when people rely on the state, and weak when people rely on themselves. This wasn't advice, it was a blueprint for an economy designed not for prosperity, but for obedience. Fast forward to the Song Dynasty. The empire is facing a crisis: metal shortages, armies need weapons, merchants need coins, people need a stable economy, but copper supplies are falling. And so China does something unimaginable for its time. It invents paper money, the first true fiat currency in world history. No gold, no silver, just trust, or rather forced trust. The state issued Jiaozi paper notes. At first, they were backed by deposits, but slowly, quietly, they drifted into pure fiat. Why? Because once the government realized it could print value out of nothing, it never wanted to stop. Inflation skyrocketed, markets destabilized, merchants protested. But the empire had discovered something far more valuable than wealth: monopoly over value itself, a power so great that it shapes modern banking to this day. Here's something few people know. Ancient China mastered a financial trick that governments still use but rarely admit: taxation without raising taxes. How? 3 silent methods. Currency devaluation: printing more money made citizens poorer, without ever announcing a tax increase. Manipulating grain prices: the state controlled grain storage. Buy cheap during harvest, sell high during famine. A profit disguised as public service. Forced labor instead of tax payments. Instead of silver taxes, citizens were forced into construction, farming, mining, and military campaigns. A free workforce, a hidden tax. An entire empire built not by revenue, but by human debt. Modern economists speak of the invisible hand of the market. But in ancient China, there was only the emperor's hand, visible, sharp, and everywhere. He controlled resources, he controlled markets, he controlled prices, he controlled currency. But above all, he controlled the narrative. When the economy failed, he blamed corrupt officials or greedy merchants. When the economy boomed, he claimed divine favor. It was politics mixed with economics, a formula still used worldwide today. Despite the system's brilliance, there was a paradox. The empire looked rich, but many citizens lived one disaster away from starvation. Because the wealth of ancient China wasn't distributed, it was stored. Stored in imperial vaults, stored in monopolies, stored in elite families, stored in land. The top 10% of society controlled almost everything. The bottom 90% survived. But in this imbalance, China discovered another secret. Economic inequality keeps an empire stable until it doesn't. Every dynasty in Chinese history eventually collapsed for the same reason. Too much central wealth. Too little public wealth. A cycle that repeats even today. Perhaps the most powerful financial strategy was one almost never discussed: the tribute system. Instead of conquering neighboring kingdoms, China used economic pressure, prestige manipulation, and strategic gifts to force loyalty. On the surface it looked like generosity, but in reality it was financial domination disguised as respect. Other kingdoms would bring tribute: gold, silver, rare goods. China would give back items that looked luxurious, but cost the empire almost nothing. Result: China profited, neighbors became dependent. Influence expanded without war. Soft power, economic power, psychological power. Today's world sees China as a modern economic giant, but the truth is, China has been a financial giant for thousands of years. Paper money, state monopolies, resource control, strategic inflation, financial surveillance, price stabilization, and global economic influence. None of this is new. All of it has ancient roots. Roots buried deep in a financial philosophy that believed, wealth is not what you own. Wealth is what you can control. And control was the empire's favorite currency. But what if I told you this was only half the story? Because while dynasties built wealth, there were also families, merchants, bankers, and secret networks building private fortunes hidden from the state. Shadow economies, underground credit systems, merchant alliances so powerful they could challenge emperors, while emperors created grand financial systems. Another world moved silently beneath the surface, a world of merchants, secret lenders, private trade networks, and families who controlled more wealth than some kingdoms. This is the hidden side of ancient China's financial power, the side the state tried to suppress, but never could. As dynasties tightened their grip on wealth, something inevitable happened. People rebelled, not with swords, but with strategy. When the state controlled production, people produced secretly. When the state controlled trade routes, merchants created underground paths. When the state taxed profits, workers hid them. And by the time the government realized what was happening, a massive parallel economy had emerged. Historians call it the informal sector. But the truth is clearer. It was a silent revolution born out of survival. Among these underground networks emerged powerful merchant clans, families that mastered finance long before banks existed. Their tools, not weapons, but credit, trust, and information. These families created something revolutionary, a decentralized financial system based entirely on relationships. If a merchant in the north needed capital, someone in the south would send it, without coins, without paper, without banks. This system used promissory notes, handwritten credit contracts, family reputation networks, secret courier systems. The state tried to monitor it, but it was impossible. Because everyone involved understood something. Trust moves faster than government. Long before wire transfers, digital banking, or international remittances, China invented fiat flying money. It worked like this. A merchant deposited silver in one city. A distant agent paid the equivalent amount in another. No coins needed to travel, no risk of robbery, no imperial oversight. It was the world's earliest long-distance banking system, and it terrified the government. Why? Because once people trusted private networks more than the state lost control. The Silk Road is often seen as a trade route, but in reality, it was a financial highway. Along its path, merchants exchanged not only goods but currency, credit, loans, information, and deals. Contracts were made with handshakes. Interest was negotiated in tents. Debts were recorded on silk slips. What made it work? Not the emperor, but trust among strangers. A Persian trader could take a Chinese loan. A Turkic caravan leader could borrow from an Indian banker. A Roman merchant could receive credit from a Central Asian moneylender. This was globalization. Centuries before the world realized what globalization was, and China was at the center of it. Silk merchants weren't just traders, they were financial engineers. Their strategies included forward contracts, buying future silk harvests at discounted prices, diversified caravans, sending goods through multiple routes to reduce risk, risk pooling alliances. If one caravan failed, all members shared the loss. Multi-currency mastery, they handled gold, silver, copper, paper, and foreign coins. Information arbitrage, they profited simply by knowing prices earlier than others. In a world without phones or internet, information was the most valuable currency, and silk merchants controlled it. Now here's a secret few people know. Ancient Chinese temples acted as unofficial banks. They stored wealth, they provided loans, they protected assets during war, they mediated financial disputes. Why trust them? Because temples had something no dynasty could guarantee: stability. Dynasties rise and fall, but temples survive. A wealthy merchant could deposit silver in a monastery and retrieve it 10 years later even if the government collapsed. This religious banking system became so powerful that emperors tried to shut it down. They failed. Because in times of chaos, people trust neutral institutions more than rulers. A lesson that echoes loudly even today. By the 12th century, the private financial networks had grown too strong. Merchants were bypassing state taxes. Temples were acting like banks. Fei Qian was outside government control, so the state responded with force, centralizing paper money, regulating merchant guilds, imposing strict trade laws, banning private minting, confiscating temple assets. But every attempt failed, because the empire misunderstood something fundamental. You can control money, but you can't control trust. Wherever trust flows, wealth follows. Ancient China's financial system was a constant battle. State versus merchants, control versus freedom, centralization versus networks, taxation versus innovation, and this tension created a paradox. The state needed merchants to stay rich, but feared them becoming too powerful. Dynasties survived when the balance was maintained. They collapsed when the balance broke. This pattern repeated for 2,000 years. Behind all strategies, all conflicts, and all financial engineering was a philosophy, a belief that shaped China's economic mind. Wealth must circulate, not concentrate. This didn't mean equality. It meant goods must move, people must trade, markets must remain alive, innovation must continue, the economy must continue. The economy must never stop flowing, because once circulation stops, an empire begins to die. This simple idea made China one of the world's most resilient economies, and it continues today in supply chains, manufacturing hubs, and global investments. The ancient formula still lives. So when we look at China today, we are not seeing a new economic superpower. We are witnessing the continuation of a 2,000-year-old financial blueprint, a blueprint built on strategic control, shadow networks, resource monopolies, credit systems, global influence, and the simple truth that money is only as powerful as the trust behind it. Ancient China didn't just build wealth, it built the architecture of economic power, a system the world still uses, often without realizing where it began. This was the hidden financial strategy of ancient China, a story lost in time, but still shaping the future.